things I want to announce before we get started. Don't forget, Thursday is a big day. We're going to start off with a prayer breakfast that morning. At 2 o'clock is Dr. Bardo's observance that we'll all be going to. And then for those of you who haven't heard, we're going to be recognizing one of our own in the Excellence Public Service. That's a Thursday at 4:30 at the Wichita Art Museum. And Daniel Schrant, construction engineer from Public Works, is being recognized. And he was actually nominated by the city of Garden Plain because he took the initiative to figure out how to get rid of a railroad track going across the street before we paved the street. So that's great news, but for all of you that are available for any of those different events, it's going to be an important day on Thursday. So, do we have any other announcements we need to start with before we get into the meeting? Very good. Well, Mr. Manager, go ahead.
Thanks, Chairman. I appreciate you mentioning that. The agenda for May 15th is light enough that I will just cover it during my weekly meetings with you. So we'll forego it today because we have a couple of other topics that will take a little bit of time. Scott's going to talk about a amendment to the comprehensive plan in relation to the Northeast Heights neighborhood. He'll take a few minutes, and then Lindsay's going to talk about the dynamics of the state tax lid and the county self-imposed lid that the commission voted for, and she just wants to walk us through some finance issues. And this will be kind of the unofficial kickoff of the budget time. We will, of course, have budget hearings tomorrow, and Lauren will give you more information about budget. But just today, Lindsay will kind of set us up for those discussions that will happen tomorrow. So with that, Scott, if you want to start, and then we'll.
Sure thing. So the Northeast Heights neighborhood is a square mile neighborhood that's immediately north of Wichita State University. It runs between 21st, 29th, Hillside, and Oliver. And they approached their city council representative, Brandon Johnson, in 2018, primarily concerned with a series of zone change requests at the northwest corner of 21st and Oliver that were considered on at least 2 occasions by the city council and not approved. I think the neighborhood was getting fatigued with repeated requests for zoning and wanted the city to establish a policy for what was appropriate at that corner as well as within their neighborhood, so that they didn't have to constantly mobilize to come out and speak against, file protest petitions on zoning changes in their neighborhood that they felt like really didn't fit the context. And so the city, I think it was actually the Planning Commission, initiated a review of the land use in the neighborhood, had a series of public meetings with the neighborhood representatives and other stakeholders that are interested in the development of the neighborhood, and came up with a relatively minor set of policy recommendations for the comprehensive plan or the community investments plan that were presented to the Planning Commission on April 4th. Planning Commission didn't actually follow those recommendations exactly, and that's kind of why we wanted to brief you on this. The City Council is considering this item at their meeting right now, so we'll know a little bit more after this morning what the City Council does. But there were 2 policies in that recommendation relating to preserving the single-family residential nature of the neighborhood and discouraging other zoning changes other than at this corner of 21st and Oliver, as well as discouraging any sort of strip commercial zoning in other locations that might occur on Oliver or 21st Street. The Planning Commission recommended that those 2 policies be removed, and so that's the recommendation that you'll be considering when it comes to you on the 15th. The other 3 policies have to do with that corner primarily of the 21st and Oliver, and how, if it were developed, it would be developed in a way that had significant buffering, screening, and other types of methods to mitigate the impacts on that commercial development on the surrounding single-family residences. So that motion the vote by the Planning Commission was 8-4 to recommend it to you with those two policies removed. And as I said, City Council's considering it this morning, so we'll know a little bit more when it comes to you next week as to what action they took on it. So be willing to answer any questions you have.
Okay, so the city council is going to require a supermajority if they want to put those two back in?
If they override it, it does require a 2/3 majority, that's correct. So it will take 5 votes to do that.
Okay. Well, while I was on the MAPC, this came before us 2
Yes,
times.
yeah.
Yeah, so we're very familiar with this corner. The neighbors to the west are very upset about the possibility of commercial at that corner, and they've been very vocal about it. So, did they come and speak?
Yes, they were involved and did speak at the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission actually considered it twice. They actually deferred it and then reheard it and adopted it with this change.
Okay.
So
Well,
what's the first one that they want removed about?
Oh, about discouraging any rezoning of single-family properties within their neighborhood. And I assume that probably is more rezoning, not to commercial uses, but to duplex or other types of multifamily.
So you can't, they're saying you cannot rezone,
Well, they're discouraging it, yes, as a policy.
discouraging rezoning of single-family residence to anything
Else, right, yeah.
between Oliver and Hillside, north of 21st?
Yeah, the 29th, yeah. So, and of course,
29th.
yeah,
And this is driven
by the neighborhood, yes.
by, if I recall,
Yeah.
there's 12 or 13 residents in that.
Yeah, there's a handful of more vocal residents, as there always is, yes.
And the rest of that square, a mile.
Yeah, it's a square mile, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, I think, I didn't actually attend any of the meetings, but from what I've heard, there were, 30, 40 people at a couple of the meetings to discuss this, which is relatively large for something like this, so.
Well,
But I think your line of questioning is pretty similar to what some of the planning commissioners thought when they didn't recommend that policy.
So the planning commission said that they do not want to remove that.
Yeah, they don't want to establish that policy for that neighborhood.
And what about this buffer stuff?
That is what
Isn't
they're
that
talking about.
typical Planning?
It is
Yeah,
pretty
but
typical, yes.
If you have a commercial or light commercial going on.
Yeah, this is a greater standard than what our typical standard is what it would establish as a policy.
I'm glad it's a city issue.
Well, and it was twice. And the irony is that it's a arterial corner with a lot of stuff going on, and so it'd be one of the few arterial corners that would have 3 corners of stuff and 1 corner of a.
Yeah, certainly with that configuration, that's correct. Yeah, with the dual lefts and
When it
all
was
that.
first approached to you at the planning and me at the council, there was still a golf course across the street.
Yes, there has
And
been a
they
lot
were
of change.
bragging that it was all this pristine golf and it's a nice area. And we said at the time, well, we know that this is maybe going to go away. And sure enough, it's going to be all kinds of stuff.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll see what the city says today. And if you all want to know more background, you can talk to the data myself, because there's a.
Well, just to be clear, if it doesn't pass the city council, it won't come to us. Is that correct?
Well, if they turn it down entirely, yes, that would be correct. It would stop at that point.
And if it does pass the city council, we would see it next week.
Yes, it's on schedule next week. That's correct.
Okay.
Very good.
And there's apartments across the street on all of them that was been zoned to do
Yes.
3 or 4 stories.
Yeah, 4 stories, and they've actually filed for their building permits. So.
Okay. All right, Scott, thanks for
Okay. You're welcome.
All right. Well, let us know what the city council does.
Okay, we will do that. No,
Can we turn it on?
probably good.
Very good. Anything else on that issue before we move on?
Thanks.
All right, Lindsay?
So does anybody want to go grab coffee before we do this? Oh, you're out. No, we'll try and move this along. Really and truly, I'll try and keep this engaging. All right, somebody might actually have to help me with the technology piece. There we go.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were all for me. Sorry.
Okay. So, as Tom said, we will be talking about the property tax lid today. Not particularly exciting, but definitely important. And we haven't really had a comprehensive discussion of what the property tax lid means for Sedgwick County in conjunction with some of the other things we have. And so this is kind of an opportunity to remind us of what we live under, because as you already know, we heard that we have compensation challenges at your retreat. You'll also hear tomorrow the beginning of about $5.5 million worth of decision packages or increases that have already survived multiple rounds of vetting from the folks around this table, because we do think they are high priority needs. And so to basically, the purpose of today's discussion is really threefold. One, to talk about all of these things and put it in kind of a comprehensive picture. Two, to talk through and give some context to the budget discussions that you're going to hear about. And then three, when I talk about that context, not only do we have the property tax lid that we live under, but we have some other restrictions that we'll talk about too. One that the state has imposed in terms of how much debt we can have, and we'll talk about that very quickly. But then also, like Tom referenced, kind of what we call the mill levy rate cap. So back in, just for some background, back in 2016, the commission took action to do two things on one day. The first was to basically limit the amount of debt that the county could have. So before that date, we had 5 measures that basically ruled how much debt we could have. The commission changed that 5th measure, which basically measures our annual debt service related to our general fund and debt service budget. That limit had been 20%. The commission changed that to phase down to 9% and then 8% once our debt got below that metric. And they actually escalated the importance of that measure so that if we were to exceed that, just that single measure, we wouldn't be able to issue debt. To go along with that, the commission also adopted a target mill levy rate resolution in 2016. And basically what it said was we were going to consistently aim in every budget, in the forecast and everything, to have the mill levy rate that was in place in the 2010 tax year for the 2011 budget, and that rate was 29.359 mils. Then it set it so that in 2023 that rate would actually drop to 28.758 mils, and the reason that number was picked is because it was essentially what was equivalent to the debt service that we expected to fall off as a result of that debt policy limit. We wouldn't be able to issue debt up to that point, and even then we didn't necessarily want to issue debt. So that was done in 16. A couple months later, the legislature passed the property tax lid as we're familiar with it. And then in 2017, the commission took action to adjust that debt policy. Instead of that 9%, 8% limit, the commission bumped it up to 10%. But we didn't have a corresponding adjustment to that target mill levy rate. And so we still have that cap in place. And so one of the things we need to talk about today is what options are available to commissioners. Of course, we can always lobby to make adjustments to the property tax lid itself, some of the exemptions and exceptions, and we'll talk about some things that maybe are missing that would be useful based on some of the things you talked about. Also, we could talk about that target mill levy rate resolution, that cap. Do we want to adjust it? Do you want to repeal it? Do you want to leave it alone? And that will not necessarily be a decision that has to be made now, but it's something to keep in the back of your minds as we work through the budget process for the next couple months. So,
Can I ask a question?
of course.
For background. So in 2016, the commission established the target mill levy for 2023.
So they did it for every year up to through 2022 at a certain level, and then they reduced that target rate effective 2023 and going forward. And so, like on the city side, for example, when the budget gets adopted, there's a mill levy rate in the recommended budget, the adopted budget. We all know that that changes in November because all you do is set a levy. The mill levy rate is just estimated. November is when it's finalized. So the city continues to use that real technically adjusted rate. What we do is every year we return back to that 29.359. So we never take into account that technical adjustment, if that helps.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the technical adjustments, but sure that I understand that in 2016, the commission established the mill levy for 2023.
Yes. And they're on, I mean, perpetual, really, under the wording of the resolution.
Okay.
So,
And the reason that was done primarily was there was debt paid off. I think for exploitation place was
Right.
primarily the discussion. So capture that debt service payment and put that back into reduction in property tax was the idea.
So there's an anticipation that between 2016 and 2023, there was going to be no other projects that would require debt as a county.
No, they could take on debt. It's just that they were going to stay under that maximum. But that one building has been something that the commission took on and will be paid off in 2022. So that was the genesis of that.
But like, then, since then, like the zoo wants the front area done and others want areas done, that would limit that decision.
Let's go on.
we'll get into all
Right.
of that discussion, I
was just trying to get the
promise.
background. Okay. That's why I asked the background.
Yep.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. So, just because all of this kind of informs our future discussion, we're very quickly going to move through the next few slides on some of the state budget law basics. So, state law says we have to adopt an annual budget. Because we are a political subdivision of the state, that means that applies to us as a municipality. Of course, that budget creates a plan for finances and it guides operations, but more importantly, it communicates your priorities to citizens and gives folks an opportunity to give feedback. It's actually mandated. So when we turn in budget information to the county clerk, which eventually gets submitted to the state, we have to include certain information in that budget form. We have to show information by fund. And again, we have more than 40 operating funds that the county has. And so for each of those funds, we have to submit information on revenues and expenses. We have to include information on our ending fund balance. Now, tomorrow, Rick's going to talk to you from the GAAP basis, the CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and he's going to talk about fund balances that includes assets and liabilities and all of those things. For our purposes today, the budgetary basis is what we'll talk about for fund balance. Cash in, cash out, what we can spend through the budget. You can't spend an inventory, right? We also then have to include the property tax levy, and I'm going to keep hitting on this point because the property tax levy is the dollar amount, and that's what the state focuses on, is that levy, not the mill levy rate. We just have an estimated rate in this budget. And then we also have to plan for an intended level of service, and so that's something that basically as the commission you're charged with by the state to make sure that you're funding services that are required and that you've chosen to provide for the community. So the state budget law requirements, again, just at a very high level, require that we have an annual budget adoption by the governing body. We have to use the prescribed form that the state gives us, and we have to account in that form for last year's actuals, the current year projections, and next year's budget. And different types of funds, as you all know, have different rules. And Lord, do we have lots of rules, because we have certified funds and tax funds and grant funds and internal service funds. And that's why you pay to have a finance department, because there's a lot going on there. We do have to maintain ending balances within prescribed limits. And so that'll be a theme that we'll talk about actually when I do the finance budget presentation. The state says that they don't want the commission basically taxing and saving up a ton of money in our tax funds. So we're only allowed to carry forward 5% of our budget in a fund per year without allocating it for some purpose. And that's also why we have such a significant amount of contingencies. We have to hold a formal public hearing to give folks an opportunity to weigh in on what we're talking about. And then, of course, there are the property tax limits that we'll talk more about, the tax lid itself, which applies to the county. And then the fire district, because it's a special district, doesn't live under the tax lid, right? It's under truth and taxation. So we have some different rules, and we're not going to beat that dead horse today. We'll talk about it later in the process. And, of course, it drives all of our deadlines. So you may think it's really obnoxious that we adopt a budget in August. We may not disagree, but we don't have a lot of options. For those of you who just want to fact check me, this next slide basically gives the statutory references on all of these rules. I'm not going to beat any or talk about any of these things, but I do want to reiterate this last bullet in the left column, and that talks about the cash basis law. For the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, we can't spend money we don't have. And so that's something that Rick will talk with you tomorrow too. There are some exceptions where we have grants where we get reimbursed after the fact, or debt proceeds where we can reimburse ourselves for project expenses, but otherwise we can't spend money we don't have at any point in time. So generally, we can't spend money unless it's budgeted, which is why Lorian will, in the financial forecast discussion tomorrow, emphasize again the difference between the forecast and the budget. The budget is a spending limit. If we don't have the spending authority, we can't spend money, even if we've got it. Whereas the forecast talks about what we really think will happen. At the end of a year, and this is something everyone has a hard time wrapping their minds around, the budget authority expires. We start over. There are some unbudgeted funds where that doesn't apply, where we talk about equipment reserve and capital improvement fund at year end. But for the most part, that budget authority goes away, and we have to start from scratch January 1 every year. And then that bottom bullet talks about how we can't move money between funds. So if you remember, we had some challenges with the EMS budget this last year. It would not have been a solution to move cash from the general fund, from the general fund to the EMS fund to fix that. We had to find an alternative because state law doesn't authorize that to happen. And did you have a question? Sorry.
And that's what we had to approve, that as a budget transfer.
Right. So basically, anytime we move cash out of the general fund to the capital improvement fund, or if we're moving cash from EMS to the equipment reserve or something like that, there will always be a resolution that you approve. So actually, when you adopt a budget, that resolution spells out the capital improvement projects you're approving. That's actually to give us authority under state law to transfer that cash to the capital improvement fund. Otherwise, we'll bring individual resolutions to you as necessary.
How common over the years does that happen?
Routinely. It's a routine matter. I would say we have at least 3 or 4 year-end transfers every year, and then maybe 1 or 2 throughout the course of the year where we just find a need to do it for a CIP amendment or some other reason. No problem. So yeah, counties have a lot more rules than cities do. So we're not as fun. So a public hearing, like I said, on the budget is required, and we have to advertise that we're going to have that hearing. That has to go in the official county newspaper. So since we have shifted to the Derby paper, that only runs once a week. So we have to be very cautious and make sure those numbers are presented perfectly. Otherwise, it's not good enough for the affidavit that we'll submit to the county clerk. We have to make sure that publication happens correctly and gives folks a full 10 days notice of where they need to be in order to talk about the budget. And in that publication, we have to include those 3 years we talked about: prior year actual, current year projection, next year budget. And that basically serves as a way to notify citizens of the maximum amount of spending that a governing body is going to do, as well as, most importantly, the maximum property tax levy that's going to be imposed. And so that's kind of what sets us up then to get into the property tax lid itself. So I have the language here. You can read it if you want, but I'm going to skip right on next to the next slide, because this talks about what does that language actually mean. Because it is definitely, it reads like the legislature wrote it. So what does it mean? I worked there. I'm not knocking anybody. We wrote a certain way. So what does it mean that the tax lid's in place? Well, basically it means that starting with the 2018 budget, we can adopt an annual budget with a property tax levy that's equal to last year's levy, but we can adjust it for 5-year average inflation. Now, that becomes somewhat tricky because we're planning the 2020 budget, right? And so that means we're looking at inflation from 2014 through 2018 to plan our next year's budget. So it introduces its own elements of challenge there.
Inflation is the CPI? Is that
CPIU, the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, seasonally adjusted. And
does things like increases that we don't know in what we just talked about yesterday, healthcare, the health?
Nope, and we're going to get into that. Thank you for setting me up perfectly for a couple slides down the road.
We should have met about this way.
No, you're playing your role perfectly.
The CPI doesn't include some things that
right.
That are
right, but it would include things like utilities. It would include things like fuel and some of those things that
they're more predictable.
Right. Well, I maybe would argue that fuel's not as predictable. And so it wouldn't give us a lot of cover if there was to be like some kind of issue like we had a few years ago where there were rapid spikes, but that's an issue for another day. But it is a backward-looking measure for a forward-looking budget. So you can do that, and you can go up to a certain amount with just a normal resolution. We follow a normal timeline, no big deal. However, if you want to exceed that amount, then we have to go to a public vote. And that public vote generates its own separate calendar. So let's pretend that we have a normal year, like we have this year. So we'll come to you in December or January, and we will ask you, do you even want to contemplate a recommended budget that would include a potential public vote? And not that we necessarily would want to do that, but if that was something the commission was interested in, we want to know that because we have to build a different timeline. But for this year, we don't want to. We know we don't want to do anything that would require a public vote. So we can follow a normal calendar that the fire district will always follow. And basically that's outlined here. So with that state property tax lid, it changed some of the timing. We get a revenue estimate for our assessed value from the county clerk on June 15th. Again, that's just an estimate. It typically always changes from June to October, November. Typically it goes down just because folks are going through appeal processes. So we have to have the notice of publication, that legal notice, by August 5th. We have to have the public hearing and the budget adopted by August 15th. And then we have to turn in our certified budgets by August 25th by state law. And just so you know, our budget, of course, this year we plan to adopt on August 7th. So let's say, though, that you didn't rule that out for us. You said, we want to keep all our options open. So we have a very different option for a calendar. So state law says that if we want to do an election, we can do it in one of three ways. We can have it at the next regularly scheduled election. So this was based on the 2018 calendar. So of course we had a primary election in August. So this kind of talks to those dates, at least initially. We can do it by mail ballot, or we can call a special election just to have a vote on the budget. So you can see that there's some different dates mixed in here, but essentially what I want to call your attention to is that if we wanted to have a vote on your budget in the August primary, no additional cost, people are going to show up, we would have to have a budget adopted by May 29th. Bearing in mind, again, that we adopt a budget August 7th, so this escalates at 2 months. If we wanted to do a mail ballot election, we would have to let the election commissioner know that by July 1st. So you'd have to have a budget adopted by July 1. Again, our target date right now is August 7th. And then depending on when you wanted to have the special election, all the results have to be certified, and we have to have a certified budget turned into the state by October 1. So we'd have to look at those dates a little differently. But it just explains kind of some of those difficulties associated with a property tax lid, particularly when we don't even get our value estimates till June 15th. So just some considerations.
You can't do the August 7th primary.
I mean, you could, but you would be taking some really big guesses.
You don't get your numbers until
June 15th, right.
And we have to have an adopted budget by May 29th.
Mm-hmm. I know.
Okay.
But in theory, it could happen. It just wouldn't be a very well-informed budget. But it could happen. So, getting into the tax lid computation then. So these next couple slides really are just a summary of what we just talked about, because then we're really going to get into what did this mean for Sedgwick County last year. So, of course, the goal for the legislature was to prevent property tax increases beyond a certain amount for citizens. There are some exceptions and exemptions, which we'll get into, but anything that would be greater than that amount that's allowed by statute would require a public vote. And so all news about the property tax lid is not necessarily bad. That bottom bullet does highlight that there were some new provisions put in place where we essentially wouldn't be hurt if our revenue decreased or if we lost value. And again, to reiterate, the property tax lid is focused on the dollars of the levy. It is not focused on our mill levy rate. There is no cap on our mill levy rate. And that matters because in some counties where there's a lot of oil and gas valuation that fluctuates a lot, that would be a real challenge for them to have that mill levy rate cap. There's no lid on assessed value. So if our assessed value grows 5% and we can find a way to fit that in under the property tax lid, we can take advantage of that. The lid, again, only applies to cities and counties. This will not apply to the fire district. And then for the fire district, it does have some rules it lives under, but there's a much greater amount of discretion and ability that the board of the fire district has in adopting a budget. So the forms that we use to figure out if we are living within the property tax lid are fairly complicated. Yes, sir.
Just back on your other slide, so the fourth bullet, the lid applies only to cities, counties, not school districts, townships, or special districts.
Right.
And it also does not apply to the 2 mills that go to the state.
Correct.
So you could add state.
I could add that there, and I will for future versions. You are not the first person to point that out. Okay, so looking at this slide then, the forms actually walk us through a process. And I'm going to go ahead and give you my surprise now. We're actually going to stop talking at slide 16. The actual form is shown on the slides past that if you really want to see the details, but I don't want to belabor those points. So if you'll just trust me to walk you through the high points, that's what I would like to do, but you can go back and look at those details. So that guide basically allows us to first calculate our base levy, again, what we're starting with from last year. Then we can calculate the allowed percentage adjustments. So for example, that CPI rate, if maybe we got new property that came, if the county expanded, or if we had a property that changed in use, we're allowed to take advantage of that. Then it walks us through how to apply those revenue adjustments. And so we'll walk through each of these, but those are the exceptions that the legislature built into the property tax lid. And that's where we'll have some discussion about maybe some things that are missing that might be helpful as we talk about your priorities. And then finally, if we levy a tax on behalf of another political entity or another government, we are allowed to take that into account. And so, of course, we do that 1.5 mils for WSU, and so we get some credit for that. So when that form walks us through it, here are the different things that it allows us to look at. So under percentage adjustments, you'll see that 5-year average CPI. If we have new improvements, if we have a personal property increase, which we don't typically see that, of course, after the legislature exempted that commercial machinery and equipment back in 2006. If there's real property added to the jurisdiction, which again doesn't happen all that much to a county, real property that has changed in use. If we did have a property tax abatement, maybe it's a TIF or some other thing where that comes back on the tax roll, we're not penalized for that. So that's that first category. Then the second category it lets us walk through are those tax revenue adjustments. So if we had general obligation debt service, so again, just as a reminder, as a county, we have a charter that says we can issue debt for facilities within a 3-block radius of this building and have that count as general obligation debt, and we can do it for bridges and most roads. But when we talk about things like NCAT or Exploration Place, those were PBC debts, and those were big dollars. And so unless it happened before July 1st, 2016, and maybe it was just structured so that we would pay more, that PBC debt that's issued after that we don't get any wiggle room for that under the tax lid. We would just have to eat that basically within that CPI adjustment. So that is something I would highlight for your consideration as we talk about maybe some potential changes to submit to the state. Any special assessments, we don't get dinged for that. If there are court judgments, settlements, or associated legal costs, we don't get dinged for that. Now, I will tell you that's a little bit harder to actually budget for because we don't know what settlements or big legal costs we're going to have next year yet. And so there is some challenge in applying that. Then, if there have been any federal or state mandates, new mandates imposed after June 30th, 2015, we don't get dinged. Or if we have lost federal funding after January 1st, 2017, we don't get dinged. Then if there are increases in law enforcement, and I'll tell you, we at least have somewhat of a liberal interpretation of law enforcement when we're doing our certified and budget. That includes the sheriff and 911 and district attorney and district court and all of those things that touch the system. And so to the extent the legislature ever provides clarifying language, that would be something we'd want to be at the table to make sure we can represent our interests there. Though we don't have fire protection services on the county side, those could be for cities. That exception could be there, and then any increases in EMS. So what I would like to highlight for you that's not included in addition to talking about that PBC is elections. So our gubernatorial and presidential elections. There's no exception for having to increase the budgets and pay for those out of tax dollars. Talking about even though you're the Board of Public Health, there's no public health exception or behavioral health exception or anything along those lines. So as you identify those initiatives, that'll be something that we're not necessarily able to accommodate under the current tax lid. And even though it's set by the state, our CAPERS and KP&F rates, there's no adjustment for that. There's no adjustment for health insurance increases or other employee benefits. There's no adjustments for cash-funded infrastructure or things like that. So there are some things that are missing from the current property tax lid that thankfully we have been able to accommodate through the last few cycles. But over time, I could certainly see those presenting issues. And so that may be something to consider as you start talking about your legislative platform. Certainly, I think that would open some doors that otherwise we may not have. So now let's apply it to the county, and let's see how this looked for the 2019 budget. So you can see on this slide that when we calculated the base levy, we started with a base levy of $130.4 million. That was the levy that was imposed to support the 2018 budget. When we applied those percentage adjustments like the CPI and changes in use and all of those things, we got an additional $5.3 million. When we applied those revenue adjustments, primarily for increases in law enforcement, that's our big ticket item. We got another $6.5 million. And then when we take into account the levy that's imposed on behalf of WSU, that gives us another $7.3 million. And so what that meant was our allowed levy for 2019 under the state's property tax lid was $149.5 million. Our levy that was actually adopted because of that 29.359 mil target was $142.8 million, which essentially meant that our remaining capacity under the property tax lid, even without those other exceptions we talked about that are not in there, was $6.8 million. And so without that mill levy rate cap, some portion of that could have been available in an equitable way that's applied against all cities and counties to fund additional services, whether that be 911 or behavioral health. So taking that into account then, like I said, we would talk about this. We do have some additional considerations. So we do have that mill levy rate resolution that we've talked about. So to the extent there's a desire maybe to increase, I don't know, aging services or ComCare services or economic development support, those are things that wouldn't be exempt under the tax lid, and we would have to work within our current 29.359 mils or 28.758 once we get in 23 and beyond. And then I want to just real briefly talk about the fact that we do have statutory debt capacity because we did talk about the debt policy. So you have your CAFR, and in the back section of that book, we publish what the legal debt margin is. So the state would allow us to issue and have $163.9 million worth of debt. When we look at the type of debt we have that applies against that limit, we only have about $22 million. So we only used 13% of our limit that the state has set for us. So when you look at
Repeat that again.
Okay.
So the state
So
law would say, under their terms,
we could have up to $164 million worth of debt. What?
We have 22 million.
Once we take so we have more debt than that, but when we take into account what type of debt it is, because some is exempt, we only have $22 million that applies under the state lid, which is 13.4% of what we could have of our capacity.
The 3% that the state.
Right. So I guess my point in telling you that is under all measures, if we look at the property tax lid or the debt service limits that the state has set, which arguably most people would say are fairly restrictive, we are doing a very good job of living within those limits, and we could still do a little more even under those limits without some of those other things that we've got. So that wraps up my formal presentation. Like I said, beyond this point are actual screenshots of the tax lid computation that we did last year, so that you can see the details if you have questions about anything. But otherwise, I'm happy to take any questions. And again, there's no decisions I'm asking for today. It's just something to keep in the back of your mind as we work through the next week and a half.
Good, I appreciate it. I just printed off a research report from KAC a couple days ago, which talks in great detail about what some of the things you just discussed. But I think it provides a little bit more background than what you've all have actually provided with us today. It compares all 105 counties, which I think that's kind of interesting on where Sedgwick County falls in that. For example, we've got almost $5 billion worth of property
Assessed value,
in
sure.
Sedgwick County, assessed valuation. We're number 2 in the state of Kansas out of 105 counties. Johnson County is more than twice as much, over almost $10.5 billion is the number 1. But as a result of that, a couple things that I thought were very interesting is when we look at the per capita levy, okay? The per capita levy for Sedgwick County is $268. We are number 105 out of 105. That's some information most people don't have. We're the lowest. If you want to know who's the highest, move out by where I got some land. And Stanton County, they're up about $3,549. Actually, they're number 2. Their mill levy is the highest at 143 mills, but that's because they got no cities like we have here. They've got to maintain the whole county, so it makes a big difference. But another figure that I thought was interesting, our 29.393, we're 103 out of 105. Only Johnson County, and obviously with $10.5 billion worth of property valuations, they're 105. That's the lowest mill levy rate. But as we look at things like our appraisal values, I know we got a lot of concern from folks about their appraisal values going up. I don't think the public realizes that that is not their tax. That is a fair market value. And I brought back from our conference last week a little document about how you appraise property that was put out by PVD. And they talked about it in great detail. We don't want to have a legislative agenda where that we're going to say we want to change and lower what the appraisal values are. The appraisal value should be fair market value, but that's not what we tax people on. What we tax people is by what their mill levy is that we put on that, and that's what we control. And the way we control it right now, I think Sedgwick County is doing a real good job at 29.393. Maybe we need to take the cap off, but it might need to fluctuate a little bit. But when we're sitting in at $268 per person, and we've got counties that are over $3,000 per person, we're doing a pretty good job, I think. So that's a story that I don't know is getting out. Maybe we need to start including it as we're telling the story of where we're at and how we're taxing the public. So, Brandon, I just printed this off, new information. I imagine you did.
We got that as an email, right?
We got that as an email.
I'm going to get that to Kate. Kate, why don't you disperse that to everybody?
And that was my comments on it. I just wanted to give a little more clarity on where we're at. Other questions or comments from the commission?
Do we have any? I know it's quite early, but based on the alternate calendar that could have happened, which we're not going to do, obviously, Do we have some numbers on our guesses for, what slide was that? Slide 15, the tax lid computation for 2020 budget. Do we have any numbers there that we could?
We don't yet. We want to get through hearings with you all and hear about your priorities. We have not even started formulating a recommended budget at this point.
Well, so far the lid hasn't been a problem for Sedgwick County since the song was passed. Is there
That's true.
a scenario that, I mean, what would
I think if we wanted to do another PBC issuance with some significant dollars, that would present an issue.
if we did an admin building for $30 million?
Well, that would be general obligation.
Okay.
So we'd be okay with that one. It's that PBC debt where if we wanted to do another big facility of some kind, which we don't currently have in talks, but certainly I could think of a number of things if we ever wanted to do performing arts or help with anything like that.
Okay.
That could present a challenge. Certainly if we wanted to do like some health stuff, some mental health hospital or mental health services, that would potentially present an issue under the tax lid, depending on how we applied it. If we got out of the business of doing a mill levy for WC, which we'll actually talk more about the history on that, and I don't necessarily think that's a real option for us, given some other things going on. But that could present an issue for us.
Do we have a list of public safety things we count as the exemptions under the public safety
Yes, I'll be
exemption?
happy to send that to you.
I'd like to see that. And then second of all, you mentioned something about roads and bridges when you were in that paragraph. Can you go back and talk about that again?
Sure. So I think we've talked before about potentially trying to cash fund some roads and bridge projects or infrastructure of any variety, drainage, whatever it may be. And there is no exemption under the property tax lid now that would really accommodate us to do that in a long-term fashion.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions for the commission?
Thank you for the explanation.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's boring.
I appreciate the explanation. As we get ready to go into the budget in more depth, it's something that we absolutely need to understand. Thank you. Mr. Manager, what else you have?
That's what we had.
That's all you have?
Yep.
All right. Staff, anything around the table? Yes.
I'll
Mark.
say that the informal equalization field meetings, they're now complete. We had 148 fewer this year than we had last year. Last year we had 4,029. This year we had 3,881. And staff's working on getting result letters out. There is a statutory deadline there of May 20th. And we are making very good progress towards certifying to the clerk on for June 1st.
You know what percentage of the appeals are granted?
They're still working on those levels.
Okay.
So,
And when you get that, I'd be interested in how we're doing there. Okay. Anything else around the table? Any of our electeds?
Tomorrow, I will be having a barbecue out in the parking lot, like we have every year for Corrections Week. Law enforcement week is following week. So for you all, you're all invited. 11:30 is one first service.
Very good. You got any details on the memorial events that we're going to have across the street and out at the memorial?
It's at 10 a.m. on 17th of May. So that's not this Friday, fall, but
Good. Now, I hope to see a lot of folks there. This year we were going to mark, obviously, Deputy Kunze's passing. So it's important to get out and recognize the sacrifices of our men and women. Thank you. Anything else from our electeds? Anybody else? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you all.
Very good.